Good afternoon. I'm John Barkdull. I'm an associate professor in the political science department and also the director of the Global Studies program, interdisciplinary program. And I'm really happy to be here. This is my second visit, and it's very interesting. My talk is entitled Adapting Political Science to Climate Change. And the message here is that the kind of political science that will be relevant depends very much on the degree of impact that we experience from climate change. And of course, that's going to depend on to what extent we can mitigate further increases in concentrations of GHG, global greenhouse gases, and so forth. So if mitigation fails, then adaptation becomes extremely important. It rises in significance. I do want to thank the Climate Science Center for inviting me to this to present my work to this distinguished audience, and also in particular, although she's not here, Dr. Hayhoe for providing cogent and expert commentary on the paper that is the basis for my talk. She did manage to steer us clear of a few pitfalls, I'll say that. A few words about the genesis of the paper. First of all, my co-author is Paul G. Harris, and he's at the Hong Kong Institute of Higher Education. He's published widely on the politics of climate change and the environment. We began our collaboration years ago on U.S. environmental policy, U.S. foreign environmental policy, and we've continued since then. The paper began as a response to an article that was published about a year ago in Perspectives on Politics, which is an American Political Science Association publication. The author was Deborah Javelin. And what she was attempting to do was to call attention to adaptation, the politics of adaptation, and to suggest that political scientists needed to make a greater contribution to understanding the politics of adaptation. The question, or the reason that we chose to write a paper in response is that we felt that she really didn't go far enough. That the assumptions in the paper were that the problem that we would be facing would be quite manageable, actually. So it was a rather managerial approach, as we called it, to the politics of adaptation in response to climate disruption. And that the article tended to ignore that at higher levels of GHG concentrations with consequent higher temperatures and other disruptions, that the social, economic, and political impacts could be quite severe, and that so a managerial approach to these problems might not be adequate, and consequently then the political science that would be pertinent would be different in type. And so that's the gist of our paper. In particular, the question, it seems to me, is whether current political, economic, and social institutions are adequate to the task. That is, to be quite specific, global capitalism, the representative democracy, a sort of consumer-oriented culture, and so forth, whether these institutions that prevail globally and domestically are adequate to the task of addressing adaptation in the future. Now, we've moved quite a bit beyond simply responding to Deborah Javelin's article, although it was the starting point. So let me take note of a few premises or a few propositions that underpin the paper. First of all, mitigation has not worked very well so far, to say the least. There's been very little. Well, for instance, the rate of increase of greenhouse gas concentrations continues to rise. And the last few Conference of the Parties meetings haven't produced very much. And I understand that there's some hope for the upcoming Paris negotiations, but if the past is any guide to the future, optimism, I think, is rather hard to sustain in that regard. At best, I would suggest that we might slow things down a bit. So mitigation is not going to be by itself the answer, and may well not be very well implemented at all. Now, secondly, in the absence of effective mitigation, from what I have read, the world is pretty much on track to about a 4 degrees centigrade temperature rise by the end of the century. somewhere around there. Now, the safe zone is supposed to be 2 degrees or below. And that's what the international community has committed to trying to sustain 2 degrees or below. But no one believes we're going to get there, from what I understand, or stay there. And some people already say that 2 degrees is too much, that we're already experiencing the impacts at less than a degree, and when we're already locked in for another 1.5 degrees, and by the time we get to 2 degrees, the impacts are going to be quite drastic already. So even within the safe zone, we're facing some pretty significant adaptation issues. But likely is that concentrations will continue to rise as population grows, as industrialization deepens, as the developing world develops, and so forth. Now, thirdly, adaptation is, of course, already happening. A lot of it's sort of local responses to things that are occurring, like the sea level rise in South Pacific countries and so forth. But it will become more pressing as climate disruption increases. Now, adaptation can happen in a sort of ad hoc way, locally and so forth, or it can be more consciously planned and done more comprehensively. And so I think that's, if you look at where the UN is going on this, the negotiations at the UN, there is some attempt to try to move towards a more conscious and comprehensive plan, although that, of course, is rather halting so far. Now, Javelin's argument in regard to political scientists' role in studying this is that political scientists have been largely absent. So the gist of her article was to undertake a literature review that covered all the major journals, and she found only a few mentions even of the politics of adaptation and no sustained effort to understand this. Now, I think a wider research that goes outside of, say, the top, the 50 main journals or so turns up more. But nevertheless, it's not something that political scientists have spent a lot of time on. And so even though the sort of, I guess what they call the gray literature, the interdisciplinary literature, the policy literature does spend a lot of time on this issue, political science has not. And so what she did and what we think we're contributing to is to lay out the research agenda. And as I said, from her perspective, that research agenda focuses on rather managerial questions. And to give an example, for instance, what are the bureaucratic politics involved in a particular adaptation project? Or what is public opinion in regard to climate change and adaptation, and how would that translate that then into policy, those kinds of things. Not that those studies have been done, that's what she's suggesting. But we think, of course, the valuable point that she made, and the reason I'm here, is that it is useful that political science should make a contribution, because after all, responding to climate change is bound to be costly. And so that means it's going to be political. There will be political decisions to be made, and that's what political scientists study. And so we can bring the tools of political science to bear on that, and presumably in terms of the policy impact, perhaps identify some of the barriers and try to find ways to improve the implementation of climate change adaptation. So what we did in the paper then, to get to the point, is to simply assess what the likely social, economic, and political impacts would be at different temperature levels, and then what the political science would be that would be appropriate to that. So that's a pretty simple framework for what we were doing. And of course, we argued that as temperatures rise, as climate disruption gets worse and more severe, that the social and economic impacts are going to increase, and then the political science that's relevant to the social disruption that's underway will change commensurately. Now, one point I would like to make is that politically, a turn towards adaptation rather than mitigation probably is not too surprising. For one thing, the fossil fuel industry prefers it, because if we can adapt to a warmer world, then we don't have to cut fossil fuel emissions. And if we don't have to cut fossil fuel emissions, then that 3/4 or so of the fossil fuels that are still in the ground in known reserves can be developed and burned and so forth. And that's where the profits are, and that's where the assets of the companies are. And we've got an entire, of course, global transportation and energy infrastructure built around fossil fuels. And so, so we don't want to give that up easily either. Another point in that regard is, well, everybody sort of recognizes that the costs will fall heavily on the developing world. Well, you know, from the standpoint of northern policymakers, that's hardly a reason to change course. Imposing costs on the developing world has pretty much been par for the course since about 1492. And so I really don't see much reason why that would change policy thinking in Washington or Canberra or London. What kind of political science will we need then? Well, again, if we can stay within that sort of safe zone of 2 degrees or below, then that managerial approach may well apply. Then sort of traditional political science on interest groups and political parties and regime types and so forth will suffice. But if things get hotter, and as they likely will, and we start to see severe disruptions, then we start to ask questions about the survival of existing and current global and political institutions. And at that point, we start to have to ask questions about transformation and change. We have to start thinking, I think, in more radical ways about what might follow on. Because, you know, it seems to me that if we're going to diagnose this problem as being really severe and really significant, we can't then prescribe ameliorative kinds of policies that barely make a dent in the problem. If it is as severe as some people suggest, then it calls commensurately for rather major changes in the nature of our political and economic institutions. You know, if we look at some of the statements that have been made, how much time do I have? A minute? Okay. If we look at some of the statements that have been made by some of the folks that are fairly well informed on this, I think one study that we were pointed to, for instance, asks, well, what would the world be like if the temperatures really rose to like 12 degrees above pre-industrial? A third of the world would be essentially uninhabitable. And so, you know, with about half the people of the world living in those areas. If you do that, I mean, imagine the political transformation, the social, the economic disruption that would take place. Or the head of the Potsdam Institute, when he was at a conference, suggested that if the temperature were to rise even to 4 degrees, the Earth could only support 1 billion people. Well, the Earth's population is going to get to about 9 billion by mid-century, and then presumably it would have to crash as we reach 4 degrees. Imagine the social and political disruption that would follow on that kind of a population crash. Now, whether that will happen or not, I don't know. We're purely in a speculative mode here, obviously. But if those are the kinds of consequences that are down the road, then we have to start thinking about political science that is appropriate to that kind of scenario. And that means it needs to be political science, as I said earlier, that goes to the roots, that really looks at how we can transform global economic, political, social institutions in such a way that they can meet the severity of the challenge that may well be before us. So, in our view, then, the time for that work is now. The managerial work the time is running out from what I've read, and so at a certain point, the increase in temperature, the climate disruption gets out of human control, and that date is not so far in the future. So the time to start thinking about transformational politics is today. That's it. I was ready to duck out. Yes.
This might be more of a comment concerning mitigation versus adaptation. So I think that a lot has gone into mitigation because we've become a lot better at modeling what a 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius change would do, and then saying, okay, what if we decrease emissions this much? What would it do? So we've become really good at that, and most of the studies are targeted at mitigation. And very few studies have actually looked at adaptation, because how do you really model that? Like, how do you model what adaptation can do in the future for humans? How will we adapt physiologically to the heat? How are urban areas changing their infrastructure, and how are people going to behave differently in the future? Those are really hard to model compared to what the climate models can do. And so this is something we've been looking into recently, because very few studies exist that can account for adaptation in the future. as a way to provide you, as a political scientist, information on this to make policy change, the studies aren't even there for you.
Right.
So I think it's really an interesting area.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, in part, sort of what got me going was some of the things that were being said more in the popular press. So, under Dr. Hayhoe's influence, we've reined that into to the peer-reviewed literature, the National Research Council, the World Bank, and IPCC, and so forth. But in the popular press, they're talking about human extinction. And I haven't seen any climate scientists suggest that, but when you have Schnellhuber of the Potsdam Institute saying 1 billion people, you're still talking about a pretty significant population reduction. And how would countries respond to that? In the current system we have, a state system of sovereign states, all heavily armed and so forth, as they see their interests being damaged, they start to reach for the tools they've used in the past. And that probably won't be pretty. It's going to be conflictual. It's going to be pretty unstable. So, not to, I don't know if that's pertinent to what you said, but that's, that's what we have to go on. And, and the other thing, and this is, I even tried to contact a demographer about this, is how do we get from 9 billion people to 1 billion people? What's the process that we'll go through? I mean, we know how we got here, but how do we reverse that? And there are very few instances of global population reduction. That just doesn't happen. It's been on a steady rise. So that's another place where we lack the models and lack the information. Okay, any further? Okay.